Thanks so much. So welcome to our discussion this morning. I'm sure you'll all agree with me that we are living in a data-driven world. So our panel today has many years of combined experience using data in the context of digital identity, compliance, innovation and transformation in a financial services context. So I'd like to introduce you to Michael Bradley, Senior Data Transformation, HSBC. We've got Matt Cumbers, Head of Conduct Risk and Financial Crime at Shawbrook Bank. John Wilkinson, CEO of TMT Analysis. And me, I'm Jessica Figueres, Vice Chair of the UK Cybersecurity Council. So let's start by talking about some of the kinds of data that's become available in the fight against cybercrime. So John, tell us about TMT Analysis. You're using some really interesting data sources, right, to power assurance products for financial services companies.
Yeah, so in the finance space, we work with mainly mobile data. So that's devices, numbers, SIM cards, and we use that for account takeover protection kind of services, anti-fraud products, but also KYC type data for low friction onboarding. So that's kind of our proposition into the fintech space. In the wider identity space, we do, using similar data sets, we do an awful lot of work around mobile numbering around the world, and for a lot of the big tech companies, we do a lot of verification and authentication processes with the mobile networks around that kind of triple lock of verifying a device against a SIM card, against a phone number, for very obvious use cases as the world uses its smartphone to obtain services, whether a user's in control of the smartphone, whether the smartphone is where it's supposed to be, and whether those data sets are matching to what they should, is kind of our little space in the large identity world.
And you're supporting onboarding checks?
Yeah, so we kind of aggregate access to the mobile networks for onboarding. So most of the mobile networks tend to have a product to their own data and their own customers. But for the fintech space, for instance, that's as good as useless, because you only get access to 20% of the customers in a market. So unless there's a kind of umbrella product where you can go to get access to the same ubiquitous data for every mobile user, it's not very interesting for the fintechs or the banks. So basically, we take the APIs from the mobile networks, create a kind of umbrella solution to allow for KYC and fraud use cases to use that data to protect and onboard new customers.
So hiding all of that complexity.
Yeah, you know, I mean, most people know mobile networks have tended to launch products at different times or in different ways or in different formats, obviously in different geographies. And so creating normalization of access to that data is an important thing. Obviously not just provided by us, there's a raft of competitors using that kind of data to make it available to the fintech space, where you can't tend to buy it from your bank or your phone company because they haven't worked out a ubiquitous product.
Good stuff. Okay, so Matt, love to hear a bank's perspective on the challenges of onboarding and customer assurance. It's easy, right? Come on, you know.
I mean, it's getting easier, you know, thanks to people like John and what he's doing. And also a lot of the great sponsors and providers that are here. Go and check them out later on. There's a plug for them. But it is challenging because, you know, consumers' views are changing. They're getting much harder to please, frankly, and they expect a much better, slicker, faster customer journey. But from our point of view, sitting here as a risk man, there's a lot of regulation that needs to be met along that way. So finding innovative ways of doing that is absolutely key to our journey. And we are getting there. We're getting there pretty rapidly. We're rolling out lots of different tools across the whole customer journey. A lot of focus on origination. If anything, I now want to look at the back book and how we improve that journey for our customers as well. Now, assurance-wise, it's pretty straightforward. You know, with the systems that we're implementing, as long as you understand how they're built and how they're coded, and we've got that capability in-house now, we're finding that quite straightforward. And from a more traditional point of view, we've got a really great QA team who go in and pull things apart and suggest ways of improving things. But it's striking that balance, I think, between digital capability and old-fashioned human capability as well.
And I think you've talked in the past about the challenges of sharing data and intelligence even within an organisation, I think.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, we're made up of 4 different departments, 4 different divisions serving different customers with different products. And historically, we haven't actually talked to each other about even whether we've got the same customer in different parts of the group, which sounds baffling. But it's only now that we're trying to approach that much fabled single customer view. And we're about to get there. We're about to be able to share data from a positive point of view to improve the customer journey, but also from an anti-fraud point of view, anti-financial crime, understanding who the customer is more thoroughly can only be a good thing.
Good stuff. So I know let's talk a bit about then the sharing data more broadly across the industry. But before we do that, it'd be great to hear from Michael, because I know that you've worked on a specific project which kind of addresses some of the issues of friction that Matt has touched on, right?
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
So just to start off, for those of you who don't know who HSBC is, we're a multinational bank. We operate in over 60 markets, and we have roughly 40 million customers. So we're an extremely large organization, and these problems are definitely something which we are looking at addressing. So if we break down what fundamentally digital identity is, at the core of that, it's data that we trust. And obviously in the perspective of a bank, it's customer data that we trust. And we build that trust at certain points throughout the customer's life cycle, starting with when we first onboard a customer. And there's then certain pieces of information which the customer give us, which we need to obviously validate that who's the individual who's giving us this information is who they say they are. And that's when there's certain key pieces of customer data, such as the name, the date of birth, which we need to then look at how do we verify this. So, for example, passports, etc., from a government issued, and there's then other bits of information, such as address, where we need to look at other forms of verifiers. So those pieces of assurance events start to build underneath those pieces of information, such as the legal name, or such as a date of birth, such as an address. And what we're looking at doing is, can we, throughout the life cycle of a customer, start to build that assurance log or the history of the pieces of assurance activity that we are conducting as a bank to increase the trust that we have with our customer. And therefore, when we do have customers who, as HSBC, have international needs, are looking to open an account in another market, how can we help smoothen that process by understanding who the customer is, so like Matt was saying, the single customer view, but then also understanding what we've done as an organization to assure that the customer details that they've given to us are actually up to date, are verified, and through that process, if we can capture that digitally through events, we can then look at automating some of those kind of tick box exercise checks, which we need to do to obviously satisfy certain policy requirements by either regulators or by our internal standards. And it's that optimization that we can then start to free up our individuals' times to work on more of the investigative tasks versus this piece of information has been verified because we've done a passport check, through the digital mobile journey. So we're looking at the full piece. How do we really create trust through that process?
It'd be great to think about the role of policy here, because I know that you told me about the difficulties of taking a bank level policy on how to do KYC, for example, and how to actually make that a reality in terms of executing against a specific customer. I think you worked on an interesting project around that, right?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, HSBC has, we have 3 broad lines of businesses. Within that, we have various different divisions operating in various different markets. Those different markets have different regulatory requirements that we need to obviously meet as a bank. We then have, the corporate governance and all the policies related to that, which flow through at a global perspective, but then are obviously translated slightly differently by different divisions and different subdivisions. So we're looking at the moment, can we take those individual policies, which may be slightly different, can we codify them in a way that we then, with this data assurance log, we can then look at and understand the definition of done or definition of whether something has been completed successfully in accordance to that policy. So by having that policy encoded and having the assurance events captured in a consistent structure, then through the customer's consent, we can then use that to feed into these various policy engines and understand whether actually with a customer moving from the UK to, let's just say, India, are there anything extra that we need to then conduct because of certain policy requirements in that jurisdiction. So it gets the level of it improves transparency, and it looks to speed up these types of checks, which we can do through an automated fashion.
So being able to encode how we use these data points in a way can really feed into automation as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We do this today, this process, obviously this data assurance process, we do it today, but the work that my team is looking at is how do we make this quicker, how do we make this easier, how do we increase trust with the customer, how do we really streamline this process. So through digitization, we believe we can achieve that.
Matt, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these ideas.
I mean, it's great, and I think full credit to HSBC. We were talking about it just now. Compared to the rest of the large banks, HSBC have the last 10 years invested more in their data and their systems than any of the others, and therefore their legacy problem, which never really goes away, but has been mitigated more than any of the others. So the type of things that Michael was talking about doing internationally are much easier as a consequence. And it's just really great to hear that investment in the customer journey. It's quite inspiring, I think, for that level of complexity. It's relatively easier for the specialist banks and for the fintechs to do that. But for the big guys to be doing it is quite inspirational in that way.
So when it comes to the challenge then, so we've talked quite a bit, haven't we, about using and sharing data within an organisation. But like you say, now we start to expand out, we start to think about the international dimension, of course the cross-industry dimension, which is really important when it comes to economic crime. I mean, what other approaches are you all seeing that can help here?
I think the fintech space is really interesting. The great thing is, if you look at these gentlemen here, right, there's the commercial pressure in fintechs to actually make the big existing players move, and they are doing. So I think there's been a kind of really healthy drive in fintechs to embrace the digital identity problem, and obviously because of payments, etc., and the importance of the data that they hold, it's important. But nonetheless, there's a lot of other people who hold important data who aren't moving as quick. So I think in general there's a movement in finance, which is good. There's obviously tons of money getting chucked at the digital identity problem. If you're in private equity or something, it's one of the things which is hot. And so that's a good thing. There's a lot of innovation happening. I would say that the one sort of slight negative for me is there's a sort of feeling in some of these communities that banks should own the digital identity problem. And I'm not completely convinced about that myself. I think if you look at the ubiquity of bank accounts in the world, it's pretty low compared to some other things. So there's a lot of very difficult problems in using bank account IDs as a solution for the world, which I think strikes as megalomania slightly to me. But nonetheless, there's a problem that they need to help with. But yeah, I think there's a lot of innovation in the fintech space and a lot of real solid suppliers building up in the market. So it's an interesting ecosystem.
So that's an interesting point, isn't it, then, about the unbanked and digital exclusion. I mean, how do we feel that the new world of alternative data can that help us to make financial services more readily available to these people?
I think one of the learnings from the pandemic has been that it is possible to make it easier. I was listening to Helen Bearden from Starling yesterday here about that and the fact that they looked at problems differently in the context of the pandemic, and we're actively targeting those customers that would be excluded, that were isolating, that would be traditionally sort of cut out from from society. And so I think that's given us the impetus to look at things more differently. I do buy into the argument that there always has to be some version of an in-person service, whether that's a traditional bank branch. I'm not necessarily convinced of that. Maybe it's a post office, maybe it's some kind of community hub. But I think that personal touch really helps to demonstrate to customers and teach them about how to work with their banking. So I think there's a limit to what we can do digitally. That said, I'm surprised every year by the advances in that space.
And what about in terms of helping people who don't have the credentials to access financial services? Maybe don't have the way to prove who they are, or to evidence their risk status and that sort of thing. Is there anything coming up that might help with that?
I think if you look at some of the markets in the world where penetration of bank accounts is very low, if you look at mobile money, for instance, and some of the African markets, I think there's a lot of really interesting work, and also because a lot of those markets tend to leapfrog technologies to get to the top quite quickly. They tend to have less of a legacy problem. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting work going on around mobile, around apps. It's been slow growth. If you think the first time we heard mobile money is probably 15 years ago, but I think there's some really powerful use cases for it now, and actually a lot of fintechs driving additional service types in that space. So it's one example, particularly in really large developing markets where there is hope of additional services, and particularly using those services for IDs, even around prepayment. So prepayment, identifying a prepaid user has become a real challenge in lots of markets and is being addressed. If you look at what's happening in Indonesia or Nigeria, lots of really interesting products taking place. Tons of different things, student products, turning into actually wider market solutions, different kinds of payment apps launching all the time. So I do think there's a sort of mix, and obviously the large banks play a big part in that, and no doubt they'll end up acquiring all these companies, and it will become seamless. But yeah, I think there's hope for the unbanked, and also thin credit file work. A lot of the credit agencies are doing tons of work now on how to look at thin file, and so I think that's another really interesting development.
Love to hear more thoughts on that.
Yeah. Just to add on that, the topic of open banking or open data. As soon as we start to explore those various avenues, customers who may be at the moment underbanked, if they have gone through certain financial institutions, maybe not the big banks, but if we can then get to a point where we can share information across the industry, maybe even spanning into other types of industries, you can start getting a better understanding for the type of customers we're dealing with. And again, like I was mentioned previously around not just sharing customer data, but from HSBC's perspective, are we able to then share the assurance activities which we've also undertaken to add the confidence in that piece of data that we are through customer consent sharing. And it's that which is going to help reduce the friction in the customer journey, because what you don't want is a customer to have to then, through different organizations, either go through different banks, having to re-provide certain documentation. If we can have that trust across the landscape and ecosystem, we can start to look to really improve the journey for the customer, and then through areas such as blockchain, trying and give the privacy back to the customer and put control of their data in their hands, which is, I guess, where things are moving.
Blockchain.
Yeah.
You said the B word.
I shouldn't have.
Come on, cards on the table. What do we think?
It's not something that we're looking at the moment. Open banking is where we're focusing our next set of efforts. But I mean, I buy into the argument. Michael sold me on it this morning that customers owning their identity data and sharing it is probably the better solution. We've talked a little bit about whether it's government that owns it, whether it's the private sector, whether it's the Silicon Valley companies. But ultimately, I think probably putting it back in the customer's hands who actually own it is probably the sensible idea, I'd say.
Yeah.
Thoughts on blockchain?
Yeah, I'm a massive believer. I mean, I think I think there's a lot of noise and problems created by the cryptocurrencies, but the sort of principle of transactions being financial transactions being embedded in the transaction that's taking place itself has a powerful impact, particularly in telecoms. In every aspect of telecoms. If you think about international transfers of data or phone calls or messages or numbers or anything, identity in particular, it's a very logical use case for a decentralized ledger approach. I think it'll take a hell of a long time, which is kind of sad. I'm not sure I'll see it, but it'll certainly happen. I think if you look at the sort of decentralized approach to identity management, then I don't see how that would work without a blockchain approach.
Yeah, it feels like something that's moving at kind of internet engineering speed, which is, like you said, kind of slow. Yeah.
Yeah, if I look at the activities that are taking place within telecoms, they're pretty narrow and thin. It's certainly not going mass market in any way yet. But I think the drivers are going to be there, and new businesses will arrive constantly.
Okay, but we do have open banking, like you said, Matt. I mean, how does open banking fit in?
I mean, it goes back to what you were saying earlier about credit decisioning. So, traditionally you'd share your credit bureau data with a lender, and they make a decision based on a fairly arbitrary score. Open banking enables us to look really qualitatively at how a customer is transacting and the type of behaviour in much greater detail than before. And so for us, we're really keen on it. We think we can make better decisions, we can lend better, and we can include more people in that. It's just for us working out how we transition from our current state, which, as I've said, is a much more manual underwriting traditional approach, to something that's much more technology driven. And I think to introduce machine learning into that as well would be really fascinating. So, okay, we've made a decision, what is the eventual outcome, and to tweak that. I think that's where we'll arrive at. But it's going to be a few years, I think, before we get there.
I think that's a great point, isn't it? Because I think we've been talking quite a bit about kind of data engineering, haven't we? But like you said, this is also about data science and actually using the information points we have to make decisions, and then kind of going back and reviewing were they the right decisions. Yeah. What's the kind of level of sophistication we're seeing there? Because not all institutions have great data science capability, right?
Yeah, it's a broad question, but I think at the moment, there's a key issue which is around resource and talent. It's actually very difficult these days to find strong talent in the area of machine learning and data science, just due to the explosion of data more generally speaking, and the awareness of what you can do with data and how you can improve customer journeys, how you can improve back-end processes. There's a struggle for data scientists, and there is variance across the board in terms of how organizations are using data and using things such as machine learning to drive efficiencies. So at HSBC, it's definitely something that we're looking at and something that we see value in. Other things such as the cloud, which gives you the flexibility to also not only deploy products and services faster to the customer, but also to have that scalability of how you are able to analyze certain data and how efficient you can be with that. So, yeah, it's a broad question, but everyone's obviously trying their best to kind of stick up to keep pace with the rest of the industry.
Yeah, that feels like an important kind of strategic piece. Like, views on data science capability?
From what I've seen, I completely agree. The expertise is limited, but from when I've seen real success happen is when you deploy the same squad of people to different problems that are machine learning problems, but in different contexts, and that's worked extremely well from the banks that I talk to, and they're gaining huge amounts from it. So their forecasting, for example, is vastly better under a machine learning model than it is under a manual one. In the big banks, that is billions and billions of pounds that can be freed up to be lent and to power the economy forward, it really does carry a huge, huge benefit. But I agree that the underlying problem is the same one, but maybe it's getting a bit easier over time.
It's really positive.
One thing I'd add is the behaviour piece. I think from the banking perspective, it's a really good example of an organisation that knows a lot of your behaviour, just from the data that they hold. They tend not to use that behavioural analysis to onboard you, that's a bad example, to check you, or to manage your life through their experience very well. I mean, they're not unique in that problem in organisations. But I think the analysis of a customer's in-life behaviour, and then how you can take that analysis and match it to new product, match it to fraud risk, match it to additional services, I think is a really interesting one. And in the mobile space, you see tons of really interesting businesses doing lots of work with behavioural analysis of how you behave with your device. But I think actually, if you think of behaviour about what do I buy, that's also a really strong indicator of where I am, what I'm doing, what's my family structure, and using that information to improve an organisation and improve its dangers and risks, I think is a really big opportunity.
No, it's a great point. Behavioural biometrics is so interesting, isn't it? So, okay, so it'd be great so that leads us naturally on to the whole topic of privacy, which let's come back to this. So I just want to say, I'd love to take some questions from the audience. So let's talk about privacy. Have a think about your questions. It'd be lovely to hear from you. But yeah, so privacy. Let's start with behavioural biometrics, because that's a great one, isn't it? I mean, how can users kind of meaningfully consent to this stuff? It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, from a, I mean, I'm not really qualified to speak on behalf of the telecoms industry, but if I were to, there's obviously a lot of private information that telecoms networks have always had about you, the content of your conversations. And so the necessity for privacy isn't a new thing. It's a rather old thing. I think that the issue in for instance, GDPR at the moment, I'm a big advocate of GDPR. I think it's been a great change. It's made organisations think about how they control data, and it's had a crack at defining some of the process flows of it. But I think the balance between the sort of consent principle online and the law is still very confused. I think if you look at the principle of privacy that we've had for like 150 years with something like your mobile phone number, it's been very useful because it's sort of you. You've got one in your pocket and it's known to you, and you consent to give it to people, but you don't really make it public in an enormous way. And then we saw that with email addresses. And so we've become used to communications having a kind of quasi-personal identification process. And now how we try and make the internet have a real personal identification process is a tricky balance. But I think there's various things that need to be done. If you think about the consent principle and your behaviour, I think that's a really interesting and tricky one. And I would say it's probably more about the law than it is about consent. But that would be my opinion.
No, I'd agree. But I think consumers are getting much more savvy with the data being valuable. I think one reservation I have, I suppose, is with the onboarding journey, we're looking at biometrics much more frequently now. Our kind of selfie tool to establish have we got the right person. But I don't think there's very much optionality there, because the alternative is for them to go and use a really manual process. So it's almost like we're forcing customers down that route. We're not really giving them the true option. And that gives me a bit of pause for thought. Don't know what the answer is, unfortunately, in that sense, because it's, for those that go with it, it's a fantastic customer journey. But it's a real challenge. But I think customers will force the issue more and more. I think their awareness of GDPR is increasing, all the time as well. So it's something for us to bear in mind constantly, I think.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think, consent is one thing, and giving your consent to another, organization to use your information, that's one thing. But then also, how that data is being used is then a separate conversation, and something which I think customers are or individuals are becoming more aware of in terms of, what are you actually doing with my information. So that's one aspect, and I guess it definitely is something which we need to look at more. And if you think about the current kind of state of play with identity providers and the federated system which we have at the moment, so things such as single sign-on or sign-in with Google or sign-in with Facebook, essentially in that instance, a lot of your data is inherently under the control of that organization. And there is then the risk of, if that organization had to get hacked, all your data is there. And I guess with the shift to blockchain, that onus is then on you. And if we think about cryptography and private keys and public keys, it's up to you to manage your private keys and the access to your data. And I think that the shift to blockchain and how we put the control in the hands of an individual, organization, consumer, is definitely something to look at, and I think identity and decentralized identity is definitely a good use case for blockchain. It's just at the moment there isn't a lot of coherence and standards around how we present these verifiable credentials. So there's not a lot of standards around that, and I guess there's a lot of work to be done with regulators, governments, individuals in the space of identity access management to really get that right. And how do we have interoperability between these different systems to try and really create a good journey for the customer, but also making sure that privacy is key to that process.
Good stuff. Okay, we've got time for a couple of questions from the audience. Questions, thoughts? Gosh, you guys haven't had enough coffee yet. Drink more coffee. Okay, so I guess it'd be great to hear before we finish today. I guess a thought from each of you about looking at the further opportunities in our space with data, with alternative data. What are you most excited about the next 5 years potential? Whoever has the quickest thought can go first.
I've got plenty of thoughts, whether they're quick or not, I don't know. So the first one is for us to be able to decision quicker. So a lot of what we're trying to do is move away from really manual processes, as I've talked about, to make decisions faster, to get better at making decisions. Intelligent use of data will drive that. So I think with the right people on board, then I think we can get there pretty rapidly over the next 5 years.
Yeah. Basically echoing what Matt said there, that's the line of work that I'm focused in is how do we make those decisions faster, but also based on trust. So trust that we know what we've done, we know the individual, the customer that we kind of is the subject of this process. So yeah, how can we increase trust across the organization, across the industry, but then how also do we use these technologies such as blockchain, such as where things are going with cloud APIs to really make that a smooth journey for the customer.
It's a slightly different one for me. I think it's a really exciting space. I think the exciting space thing in the digital identity space is we kind of don't know who's going to win it. I'm pretty sure it's not going to be Facebook, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, personally, and we don't know how the landscape's going to evolve and what the new sets of products and the new sets of solutions are going to be. And I think blockchain and crypto and those kinds of new entrants are going to have a real powerful impact on it. And so I think it's an interesting space because it's exploding and we don't know the answer yet. So that's why it's exciting. In terms of what the steps are, it's obviously a bit slower than we'd like, but I think the big guys have kind of opted out, and that's a healthy thing for the rest of us.
All to play for. Mm-hmm. Great. So John, Matt and Mike, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.